Welcome to another fascinating edition of the Chocolate Box Presents. And I am your guest host, Willie Royal, sitting in for the vacationing chocolate drop. And today our topic is why critical race theory? And my guest is Jen Neitzel. Jen will introduce her later, but welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You're very welcome. So, actually, you're Dr. Jen Neitzel, and you are the Executive Director of Educational Equity Institute.
That is correct.
Okay. Jen, can you tell me, let's tell a story. The half-hour interview is really an interesting little art form. And so critical race theory is obviously a very hot topic, and it's generated some heat. In fact, I met you virtually at a school board meeting, July 13th, CMS board meeting, and there were 84 speakers dealing mostly with critical race theory, and it was a hot board meeting.
It really was, yes.
And after seeing that, I reached out to you, and we had some things in common, and we agreed that I'd do a little administrative work for the Educational Equity Institute. So out of a sense of disclosure, so there's that. Why don't we start off with a little bit about your background? So where are you from?
I grew up in Pennsylvania, so very small town in south central Pennsylvania. There's a joke about that area of Pennsylvania that it's Pittsburgh on the west, Philadelphia in the east, and Alabama in the middle.
I've heard that.
Yes, so I grew up in Alabama, so I basically spent my entire adolescence, if not longer, plotting my escape from that town.
And when did you leave? How old were you when you left?
I was 18, so I went to college at the University of Pittsburgh, and I stayed there for 5 years, and then I moved to North Carolina because I knew I wanted to go to graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill, and but I worked for a year in a group home for adults with autism before I went back and got my master's degree. Then I taught for 2 years in a preschool for toddlers with autism, and then I went back to school for my Ph.D.
Okay, undergraduate in what?
Child development.
Child development. And your graduate degree at the Chapel Hill, master's in what?
They're all three in early childhood.
Early childhood,
Yeah.
okay, wow. And so
Yeah.
Ph.D.
Yes.
in early childhood as well.
Yes.
All right, so, and then now we are, so that was the end of your academic background.
Right.
So then let's talk about professionally. What did you do from there after you got your Ph.D.?
Well, okay, so there's this institute that's associated with UNC Chapel Hill. It's called the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. And so after I got my Ph.D., I worked with a lot of researchers there during my, both my master's and my Ph.D. program. And so I just kind of rolled into work there and eventually became a researcher and technical assistance provider there. And I was there for 18 years in some form or fashion, because I taught there, I was a student there, and then I was a researcher there as well.
So you a tenure track, a professor?
No, it was like you could get promoted, but I also taught in the School of Education at UNC as well. So it was kind of, I did not, it was not tenure track. Either one of them were not tenure track,
Okay.
no.
Okay, all right, so various capacities in academic, at the academy, and then 18 years, right?
Right.
And so from there, what'd you do?
Well, I can talk about how I got involved with equity, because that's where it started. So
Yes.
I was put on a project at Frank Porter Graham to examine the disproportionate number of young black children who are suspended or expelled from early learning programs. And so the U.S. Department of Ed, Office of Civil Rights, has been collecting data on K-12 for decades, but in 2012 was the first time they collected data on young children. And so their data showed that black children are up to 4 times more likely, young black children, we're talking about 3 and 4-year-olds, who are up to 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from an early learning program. Okay. And so when I saw those data, I had a choice to make, right? As a white person, I could continue to ignore those data that I had never seen them before, or I could commit to being a part of the solution going forward. And obviously, I committed to the solution going forward. And that's when my work just completely went into implicit bias, the role of implicit bias, and then surely it's not just implicit bias, it's got to be the systems themselves. And that's what brought me to the Educational Equity Institute.
Okay, and so when you say brought you to it, you founded it.
I did, yeah.
Okay, so, and was that here in Charlotte, or weren't you?
Yeah, so we moved to Charlotte in 2009 because of my husband's job, but I was able to keep my job at Chapel Hill and work remotely for 10 years, yeah.
Okay, all right. So you found the Educational Equity Institute, whose mission is what? It's
changed. So my business partner is Ebonice Mead, and she and I have been working together for 5 years. And so we actually, even though I started it, she and I have worked together to develop the vision and the mission and all the guiding principles of the Educational Equity Institute. And so it's really changed significantly. And part of it was we just started out, I forget what our initial mission statement was, really, because it was so long ago. But we changed our vision and our mission and our guiding principles after the murder of George Floyd.
Okay.
And so that's when we both, it's kind of like our brains are connected by this wire. And so she and I both had almost the same moment that we're all in pain. We've all been traumatized and victimized by racism and white supremacy in this country. And so we all need to heal. And so we really see the pathway to equity in education is through racial healing.
Okay.
Both for Black people, but also other people of color who've also been victimized by white supremacy and racism, and then white people have to heal as well.
You know, the weird thing, Jen, is I've been working on racial issues basically out of a sense of feeling inferior, struggling with that for about 40 years. I'm 62 years old. I don't think there's an area that I've dedicated more mental energy than that. And the strange thing is, I've worked about 33 years in professional life. I've never really had a personal conversation with a white person about racial issues. I think that's very strange. So we're going to give our listening audience a chance to kind of eavesdrop on our conversation. So you mentioned the term white supremacy. I'm going to ask you to define, however way you want, what is white supremacy vis-a-vis whiteness? What is white supremacy and what is whiteness?
Okay, so now you're going to get into a little bit of history lesson here.
Okay, all right.
But so white supremacy, people often jump to like the KKK and the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. They're white nationalists, which is an offshoot of white supremacy. But white supremacy is actually just a culture. It's an ideology. It was used to set up all of our systems. And so it's not when people, that's why white people get so triggered by white supremacy, because they think that we're talking about people. We're not talking about people. We're talking about a culture and ideology that places, explicitly and implicitly whiteness at the center of white superiority. And so when we're talking about whiteness, we talk a lot about all of these things in our trainings that we do with educators. And so when we're talking about whiteness, we have to go back to the social construction of race. And so race didn't exist until the 1700s in this country. And so what happened is that there was this thing called Bacon's Rebellion. And so prior to that, we had Black indentured servants and white indentured servants living together. They worked together and under the same horrible conditions. They were treated poorly the same. And so they decided, we're going to get together and we're going to rebel. And so there was this thing called Bacon's Rebellion. And after Bacon's Rebellion, they tried all sorts of different ways to divide and conquer. And they tried religion, they tried language, nothing worked until race. And so what they did is the construction of whiteness, the first time it's mentioned in the United States was in the Virginia Constitution. And that's when all of these
What year is this? Roughly, just roughly.
Oh, sometime in the 1700s.
And that's fine. So around the 1700s.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Okay.
So when when we think about the 1619 Project, right, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, they actually became indentured servants. And so we didn't have chattel slavery in this country until the 1700s with the social construction of race. And so what that happened is that whiteness became associated with affluent whiteness, right? And so what the affluent whites, they were just focused on controlling money and power. And so what they did is they had this divide and conquer strategy between the poor indentured servants who were able to work off their servitude, but blacks were enslaved after that. And so they would give the white indentured servants, they would give them small parcels of land, they would make them overseers on the plantation, and so they became slave catchers. And so all of this stuff, but they were given, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the wage of whiteness, and it's like, at least you're not that. And so that's how they were able to absorb those poor white people into whiteness, because you're going to get these small wages, you're going to get these quasi-leadership positions, but at least you're not that. And they were like, oh, okay, that's good, because then I don't have to be a slave, I don't have to be treated like that. And that's what we got to, this whiteness. And when we're talking about whiteness in this country, it's that affluent whiteness that everybody is striving to achieve.
Interesting. So in my head, there's a certain utility to that. So when I think of people who are white, who vote against their own interests, right? And just for no other reason, they're manipulated to vote and to advocate against their own interests. And in my head, it's just this idea, at least I'm not black.
Right.
Right? And so that there's a utility to that type of manipulation historically.
And it's on purpose. It's happening right now.
And it's happening right now.
Right.
Now, another thing that's interesting to me is we talk about white supremacy, racism, and so forth. And when you say white supremacy, there's a tendency of white people to think that you're talking about individuals personally.
Yes.
And it's a personal offense or whatever. But I think what we're talking about is I'm a systems theory guy. So we're talking about systems, institutions. Neely Fuller talks about 9 areas of people activity: education, labor law, sex, politics, war, and so forth.
Right.
So in each of those domains of social life, there are institutions that have policies and procedures and so forth.
Right.
There's a machinery of building white supremacy, and these institutions serve as to perpetuate that. So when we say white supremacy, if I'm not mistaken, that's what you mean, or
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm not talking about individual people, I'm talking about the structures, and that's where the conversation needs to go. So when we're talking about racism, with white people, they immediately go to, and that's like, if you want to get into critical race theory, that's the whole thing. Like these laws that they're putting in place, you can't make a white person feel bad about themselves. You can't do anything that makes a white child uncomfortable. You can't talk about systems and those kinds of things. And it's because white people, we live not in a country of white guilt. We live in a country of white shame. We are so ashamed for our history that, and when we're talking about shame, it's like shame you deny, you reject, you push away, you attack others. And so that's what we're seeing right now with this attack on critical race theory, is that it's trying to make it an enemy because people don't want to face the past. And that's why the healing is so important. Like when we're talking about racial healing, you have to, one of the first phase is acknowledgement. Yeah. You have to acknowledge, and then you have to atone. If you're not willing to, that's why racial healing is so important, because people don't even want to acknowledge our past. And we're not going to get anywhere until we acknowledge and atone for our past.
And that, I think in terms of logic and sequence, when the atrocities of slavery and Ta-Nehisi Coates points out, it isn't just that slavery happened, all the centuries of slavery, but all the disenfranchisement, systemic disenfranchisement that locked black folk out, like districting of housing and redistricting, that sort of thing. All that just mounted up and so forth. Why don't we go back and talk about critical race theory? The topic is why critical race theory. Is critical race theory being set up as a straw man, a boogeyman these days?
Yes.
Talk about what critical race theory really is and how it's being used now as a foil, as a front.
Right. So I've been listening to this podcast called Southlake.
Yes.
Have you listened to it?
All editions, yes.
Right. I haven't listened to all of them yet, but I don't know if you heard about that story this week about the school district in Texas that wants to teach the competing argument against the Holocaust.
Yes.
Okay. That's that school district. Right.
Wow.
And so it's very interesting, because that's such a microcosm for what's going on in, what you saw at the school board meeting with the people coming out and spouting all of the talking points, using Dr. King quotes out of context and, saying that it was divisive and not wanting, our children to feel bad. And it's like, when they say our children, they're talking, which children are they talking about? Because they're not talking about black and brown children. They're talking about white children.
Right.
And so with critical race theory, I forget, and it has to get political because everything's political in this country. We just don't want to acknowledge it. But I forget who it was who started it. But
Derek Bell at Harvard University was one of them.
Right, and then
and other law professors at Harvard, and so it's really a theory, a pretty sophisticated legal theory that's only being taught at higher echelons of law.
Right, I'm talking about the guy who turned it into a boogeyman, and I can't remember who did it, but then as soon as he did it, Trump jumped on it immediately.
Okay.
And so this has become a talking point for all of these people, just because, and it's to avoid talking about race and racism. And it happened, after George Floyd particularly, because of the groundswell of support for Black Lives Matter at that time. There had to be a pushback, because there always is.
If I were to do sort of a glossary of terms, which we don't have a lot of time to do in a half hour, but another term that's come to fore is an anti-racist. And the brother who wrote the book, Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. What is an anti-racist?
Well, it's not a destination.
Okay.
It's a journey. I am an anti-racist, but I have not arrived. I'm constantly unlearning my whiteness. I'm constantly checking my implicit biases. I'm constantly learning more and more about history and, everything that's happened. It's a journey that can't stop. And, Ebenezer and I have conversations about this as well. It's not just white people, it's black people have to do the unlearning and the learning as well. And so it's just, to be an anti-racist is to educate yourself. We talk about not being accomplices and co-conspirators, not allies.
Yeah.
Ally, we think, is too fluffy.
Yeah.
We really have to be co-conspiring together.
Yeah.
And accomplices in this work. And so for white people, I think it's particularly, it's an incredible journey for them. It takes a lot of deep self-reflection that a lot of people aren't willing to do, because they want to check the box of anti-racism, and that's just, it's not an easy journey being an anti-racist.
And as you mentioned, whether you're black, white, or whatever, this system is so pervasive that it infects, I'm going to use that term, whether institutions, people, whether you're black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or whatever, we're all infected with white supremacy because it's that ubiquitous. Jen, Jen, why is whiteness as an idea, why is it so difficult for white people to reckon with or even recognize?
Well, we talked about this in the green room, that white people don't talk about race and racism. Like,
That surprised me, because when black people are together, we talk about racism all the time. I assume that white people talked about racism all the time when we're not in the room. And no.
that's whiteness playing out, because we don't have to see race and racism if we don't want to.
There you are. Mother is the necessity. How does the saying go? Mother is the necessity of invention, or something like that.
Right.
Of necessity, I have to know about racism. If I don't talk to my son about how to deal with the police, he'll wind up dead on the side of a road. My white peers, they're not going to face that same challenge. So that's just a small example of why I can't afford not to see it, but whites can afford not to see it. And what am I missing there?
I just think, I think part of it is, we just don't have, we don't, like, the murder of George Floyd and COVID made it not, white people couldn't look away anymore to the racism, because we thought we were living in a post-racial society. And so more conversations have started to happen with white people, but white people will not engage in cross-cultural conversations about race.
Okay.
Because they're afraid they're going to come across as racist.
Unless there's some catalyst or impetus to do so, which is an excellent transition to the work of the Educational Equity Institute. So let's talk about what it is you do. First of all, who are your clients? Who do you work for? Who do you contract with?
A lot of early childhood organizations, also K-12, high schools. We worked with large federally funded projects. We're working with 2 universities starting next year. A lot of just consultation with different groups around white supremacy culture and how that shows up in themselves and the work that they do. And so helping them deconstruct that. But we do a lot. We started out just doing trainings. Like, we do this, like our introductory paradigm shift training, which is focused on creating a common language regarding key terms and equity. Then we move into, but that has changed too. Like, after the murder of George Floyd, we're going all in. Like, we're not.
Tell me about going all in. What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
We talk about anti-blackness.
Okay.
We talk about whiteness and white supremacy. We talk about, it's a very difficult training, but I would say that the historical and racial trauma training is more difficult. It's very exhausting just for everybody.
Emotionally? Yeah.
Yeah, because we really dig into our history.
Right.
And what we do when we go into communities, I always research the history of that community around slavery and lynching and indigenous peoples, so it makes it really in your face and real for people, not just like I'm here to make you uncomfortable, which I am, but it's more for them to understand that this history, like when we went into Rowan County, and 27% of their population in 1860 were slaves, and then the more important thing is that there were 6 known lynchings in Rowan County, and 2 of them were 2 little boys. This is why it's so hard. 11 and 13-year-old boys who had been lynched for looking at a white woman, and they were brothers, and they had the same last name as another man who had been lynched. And during the training, it came out that they were relatives. This guy was the boy's uncle, and then somebody said their family still lives here, and so that's why we need to heal. This is it's in the ground of communities, and I know we're running out of time, so I can't tell you even the worst statistics from Charlotte. So it's there are 49 slave cemeteries in Mecklenburg County.
Oh my gosh.
So.
Continuing on with the work that the Educational Equity Institute does, so there's the difficult psycho-emotional work of recognizing the difficult issues and so forth, and having a conversation, and creating a safe space to have that conversation. Jen, is there a component where you actually go in and examine policies and practices and try to ferret out from a systems perspective how those institutions perpetuate that? Do you do that?
We are now moving into that work with several organizations. Like tomorrow we're like the keynote speakers at Child Care Aware, which is like a national organization and that is focused on child care across the country. And so we're going to push them into systems change tomorrow. But a lot of the work that we do is we help organizations deconstruct deconstruct anti-Blackness and deconstruct whiteness and how it shows up in the organization, how it shows up in early childhood, how it shows up in K-12. Because if we're going to really change things in our educational system, we have to deconstruct anti-Blackness and whiteness.
Okay. I know that the Educational Equity Institute does their own publications and creates, content for your workshops and so forth, but you're about to publish a book as well, is that right?
It's going to come out in 2020. I'm writing it right now, but
Okay.
it's an edited book, and
Okay.
so Ebenezer and I are the editors, but yes, it's a handbook of equity in early childhood.
We're quickly coming to the end of our conversation.
Whitman's. That's what my grandmother had every Christmas.
Well, this is the Chocolate Box Presents, so the Chocolate Box is about to present, and this comes from a line in Forrest Gump. You never know what you're going to get.
You don't. It's so frustrating because
Right.
you'd always get the like raspberry one.
Well, the Chocolate Box is going to present you with a choice.
Oh my gosh. Okay, this is really hard. Okay, which one is not the raspberry one?
Oh, you never know what you're going to get.
I know. I don't like it. Okay, that one.
And I'm going to join you.
Okay.
Last question or last point. If we don't address this, what's going to happen?
Nothing's ever going to change.
And we're going to be doomed.
And it's going to get worse.
And it's going to get worse.
Well, we see it right now. The education system is crumbling.
Yeah. Fascinating conversation, Jen. Difficult conversation, and I think I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And I know that in this political environment, that can't be easy. And
It is what it is. It's like, it's not, I know when people come after me, it's not about me. They're just coming out. I'm just the messenger. So.
Yeah. But still, it takes heart to do the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there are easier ways to make a living.
Yeah.
And you could have chosen to do that, but you didn't.
No.
And in my head, that's what a patriot is. That's what a patriot
Agreed.
does. Right? If you really love this country, you critique it and try to make it better.
Agreed.
As opposed to sweeping it under the rug.
Agreed.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
Hey.
Oh yeah, I gotta find out what I got.
Well, I have solid milk chocolate.
I don't know what that is.